Why it was in news? Yes. You must have come across this news, no? In September month. Recently, the government came up with this data of the first quarter of this financial year, GDP data. And immediately there was criticism on that data. It was saying that the country is, economic growth, GDP growth is happening at 7.8%. Okay, the Q1 data. First quarter, April to June. And immediately the former finance minister Jairam Ramesh, he criticized this data as overstated, overvalued, biased, inflationary. Okay. So there were several articles, including explained page in Indian Express, explaining the problems, issues with calculation of GDP in India. And this becomes very important topic for our GS3 paper, economy part. They love GDP term. Okay. They will ask like, what are the changes made after 2015? Already asked. They will ask about what do you mean by, let's say, GDP, or what are the drivers of economic growth in the country. Or they will ask related to calculation methodology. Largely they are focusing on this calculation methodology. It is given in NCERT. Even that comparison before 2015, after 2015, that is also given in NCERT. So that means they are largely asking question related to calculation aspect. What is GDP, GVA, that thing they can ask, right? So let's try to stick to this particular issue, and I will then broaden the issue in terms of whether GDP is the right measure for welfare of the economy. जिन्होंने टक्कर टेस्ट सीरीज दिया है कल का पेपर, you may have come across this question, whether GDP is the true measure of welfare of the people in the country. Already it is discussed in NCERT. Okay, we will try to understand this. Fine. So let's try to understand what are the issues in the calculation, GDP calculation, or at present this particular issue highlighted by, we can say, through criticism regarding this GDP data. Let's try to understand this first. The first issue is related to nominal and real GDP. Nominal and real GDP. And second is related to the term statistical tool, we can say. Discrepancy. Okay, discrepancy. This term is economic term, or a tool called as statistical tool. I will explain this, and we are going to provide you one-page note also for today's session. Okay, and now we will try to follow this method of providing you printed one-page note, ताकि आपको मतलब लिखने की भी जरूरत ना हो, इसका प्रिंट आउट ले लो. ठीक है, एक ही इसमें मैंने क्या किया, कॉन्टेक्स्ट, इश्यू इन ब्रीफ, व्हाट इज डिस्क्रिपेंसी, व्हाट इज जीडीपी प्राइस डिफ्लेटर, इश्यूज विद जीडीपी, वे फॉरवर्ड, कंक्लूजन. ओके, फाइन. Coming back to the discussion, we learn about nominal GDP and real GDP, its meaning in NCERT. Let's try to revise that. What is nominal GDP? When we calculate this gross domestic product. What is gross domestic product? It is nothing but the aggregate value of all the goods and services produced within the boundary or territory of the country, okay, by all individuals. So we can say that is GDP. Now GDP is generally calculated at current prices and at base prices. At current prices, when the GDP is calculated, it is called as nominal GDP. And when we say that it is calculated at the prices of base year, we call it as real GDP. Now, why these two separate calculations? Let's understand that. What happens in every economy is there are, we see that GDP is always growing for every economy. It can be either because of there is real increase in the production of goods or services, or there can be increase in the prices of existing number of goods and services. In any way, there will be increase in GDP. When we say that it is nominal GDP. Generally, we say that it is nominal GDP, right? Every year we are giving this data related to nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is always expansionary, barring few cases. Like for example, during COVID-19, what we had is fall in nominal GDP. That is exception for most of the countries. Understood? Why nominal GDP tend to increase? Either because of increase in number of goods and services, or they remain the same but their prices increases. Now the problem of this price increase is not truly understood or we can say identified for the policymakers to take right decisions. And to identify the difference between the real increase in the number of goods and services and the inflation in terms of price rise. That can be understood when the calculations are done both. Nominal GDP. How? Because the real GDP is basically taking into consideration the effect of inflation. When we remove the inflationary effect from GDP, we get the real GDP. Inflationary effect in terms of how much price rise of those goods and services has happened over the period of time from base year. Be very clear about this concept. Okay. Now, to understand this difference properly, these two are calculated. Generally, what happens is we only focus as a common people on this data. Also, government trained to provide this data. इतना बढ़ गया, क्योंकि वो बढ़ने ही वाला है. But let's say, due to some other factors, there are inflationary pressures in the economy. Like last 1 year, there has been inflation, high inflation because of external factors, right? Oil crisis and all these things. Now, whether nominal GDP will provide true picture of economic growth in such scenario? So, the criticism says that if we take into consideration the inflation data, this 7.8% will reduce to 4% in the same quarter. How? Because during these 3 months of April to June 2023, if we say the inflation data, if we consider the inflation data of CPI, CPI was very high during these 3 months. That shows that inflation was very high. That means this figure is because of inflation. But at the same time, there is one problem in calculation. If we consider the indicator of inflation as WPI for these 3 months, this will reach to 8%. How come? Because for these 3 months, WPI was in negative, less than 0. That means prices not have increased, rather the number of goods have increased. This growth is reflecting number of goods and services. It shows that there is some problem with these indicators itself, WPI and CPI. See, we are digging in deeper now to understand this issue. Okay, but you should understand, government while calculating, or the NSO ठीक है, National Statistical Office does not consider either of these two as a measure of inflation, CPI or WPI. Rather, it uses GDP price deflator. What is deflator? NCRT बताइए everyone. Yes, nominal upon real GDP into 100. Okay, but it is a measure of inflation in the economy. It is a measure of inflation in the economy like CPI and WPI. But there is one major difference between these two. Yes, Anand, true, nominal upon real into 100. But there is major difference between these two. And what is that?
Sir, in GDP price deflator, goods are only within our territory. But these CPI might include imported goods as well.
No, that is not the major difference. Major difference is that for CPI and WPI, we have fixed the basket of goods and services to consider or to calculate CPI. CPI includes goods as well as services. WPI only goods. WPI calculates this inflation levels or inflation levels in the prices, increase in prices at production level, while CPI calculates it at retail level, consumer level, right? So the major difference is that the CPI and WPI, they have fixed basket of goods and they will see the price variations in those only, while GDP price deflator considers price changes in whole economy, nominal GDP upon real GDP into 100. Whole GDP, whole we can say that country, and let's say new kinds of, let's say, goods and services. Okay, so thereafter it will also try to understand the new investment trends in the economy. Okay, so that's why government consider this as a better measure of inflation in the economy. This can be asked in prelims also.
So the government is considering GDP deflator as a better measure.
Yes, better measure. And yes, the pure economics will say that this is the better measure as compared to this. They have their own significance. Okay. This is very helpful for monetary policy, no? This is helpful for monetary policy, CPI, WPI, right? So all this, the 6% target maximum, that is CPI basically. Okay, so now you have understood this, that GDP price deflator is used by government to understand or take into consideration this particular inflation aspect. But when we say that CPI and WPI is considered, it is giving different picture. That means the inflation that is happening in the country or in the economy is not truly calculated by this. Why? Because of lack of adequate data and lack of updated data. Okay, lack of adequate data and updated data with the government. Why this discrepancy is happening in terms of calculations? Because of lack of availability of quality data. Main reason is this one. Okay, so now first issue you have understood. What is the problem with nominal and real GDP indicators? Now the second one is discrepancy, a statistic tool. The statistical tool used by NSO while calculating the GDP, it says that when we calculate nominal GDP, and when we calculate real GDP, this nominal GDP calculation in the country is done by the government on two methods. कौन से method use करता है government? Government uses two methods. Income and expenditure method. Okay, income and expenditure method. This year's mains examination question, no? Related to what you can say, methodology, GDP calculation, economy. इसी साल था ना? What are the problems, issues with this methodology? So income and expenditure method is used by the government. Okay. Now what is problem with this? Let's try to understand. When the government is calculating the income of the people, it is not able to understand where and how much it is spending. And when the government is trying to match that income with the expenditure, government finds there is a difference. We don't know कहाँ जा रहा है पैसा. रख रहा हो ना घर पे लोग छुपा के. वो रेड मूवी में देखा होगा आपने, है ना? घर रख देता है कहीं पे ऐसे छुपा के. Yes, I'm telling you that when the government calculates GDP figures on the basis of income method and expenditure method, it finds there is difference in the value of GDP. Okay, it is not able to match. Ideally, in the economy, in the account books, they should match. Ideally, they should match the amount of income that people are earning. There should be expenditure also. Okay, so that means there is a difference, and at such difference is not the problem when it is small. Why? Because the government from time to time gets the updated data, and that's why the updated figures of GDP are published. How? The government can get in real time the income data, but people are doing expenditure over the period of time. No? And at the same time, the data related to, we can say, GST expenditure, it will be calculated through GST. That data needs to be updated. Whenever we go to shop, do we ask for GST bill? The shop owner or vendor will say that GST bill chahiye, without GST bill chahiye. If that transaction is not calculated, then that means this expenditure. Okay. So this is how discrepancies will be there, and when this difference is basically termed as discrepancy as a heading, a separate heading in the account book of the government, as a discrepancy is given, and this is the difference basically between the income method calculation and expenditure method calculation of GDP. Okay, the better the accounting methods, collection of data of the government, the lesser will be this difference in the economy. The more and more formal the economy, less and less difference will be there. Understood? This is very important. And now, after understanding this discrepancy issue, you got the idea that what is at present issue in terms of calculations. So the problem here, as I have highlighted,
any discrepancy in calculating the real GDP?
Real GDP. Yes, there is a discrepancy. How? At present, what is the base year? See, don't use the discrepancy word, as discrepancy in terms of accounting or statistics is this one. Okay, rather we will say lacuna, limitations of calculating real GDP is that we need to update base year from time to time, otherwise we do not get true picture. At present, 2011-12 continued. After every 5-6 years, we need to update base year. So there is demand to change the base year to 16-17 now, but government has not done that yet. Now, once you revise the base year, immediately your growth projections fall. Why? Because the more and more difference between the current year and base year, more and more expansion of GDP, economic growth will be reflected, and that's why more and more or the higher values of nominal GDP will be there. This is what government want. Right? So, before election year, of course, they will not update this one. Right? So, now you have understood